Hi there, Adam Gower here, and welcome to the real estate crowdfunding show syndication in the digital age at gowercrowd.com. Today's guest, Scott Choppin, founder of Urban Pacific, a development company in Southern California, and I talk about a topic in which he is the foremost expert in the country, workforce housing. This episode is the second that doesn't focus directly on digital marketing, but instead addresses a topic that I am constantly being asked to explain by listeners. Scott has been working on a new model for workforce housing that he is about to scale up significantly, having proven his development thesis for it with several successful deals. He's a very interesting fellow. I've had the pleasure of continuing several conversations with Scott recently, some of which you'll be able to tune into on his website and also on YouTube. Though I know he's going to want you to pay attention strictly to his workforce housing deals, do keep a lookout for his insights into how to apply strategy that he has learned from the ancient Japanese game of Go to achieve the incredible success that he has had in real estate development. I'll be sure to include links to Scott's website and his social media channels on the podcast page for today's episode at gowercrowd.com. Scott has been putting together a first-class digital marketing program engineered by, have a wild guess who, to educate his investors and to raise capital for his deals. I can show you exactly the secret to how he does that. All you need to do is to watch the whiteboard workshop on the podcast page for today's episode at gowercrowd.com, where I walk you through digital marketing's secret weapons, all of which Scott is putting together himself. That's all there at gowercrowd.com. Okay, so now sit down, relax, and enjoy probably the most in-depth analysis of workforce housing, what it is, and how to make money developing it from the nation's foremost expert, Scott Choppin, founder at Urban Pacific. Scott, what a pleasure to see you again.
Adam, great to be here with you.
Thanks for joining me on the podcast. We've been talking a lot, you and I, recently. And you have a very, very interesting value proposition when it comes to workforce housing with your deals and your opportunity zone deal and everything that's going on. But what I'd like to talk to you about today is what is workforce housing, basically. Let's get into the DNA of that.
Absolutely.
So why don't you kick off, if you don't mind, tell me, define for me, what is workforce housing?
So fundamentally, what I consider workforce housing to be is to serve families that are sitting in the middle between true affordable housing and luxury, high-end market rate housing. So I'm going to give it to you in a few different versions. So on an income level, we're serving families between 80 and 120% of median income, and that would vary by county and state and whatever market you're in, of course. But more importantly, we're looking for creating a product that serves families, however their income is generated, that are basically being ever sort of drop lower in the food chain in the marketplace. So they can't afford luxury. They don't make enough generally to afford brand new luxury housing. They make too much to qualify for true affordable housing, what I call, government subsidized, true affordable housing. And there's this gap in between those two spaces, and it's actually a widening gap when you consider that rents and housing costs are going up generally in all major urban metro markets, but wages are stagnant, and they're stagnant for this group. They are stuck in the middle, in essence. And so our offer of workforce housing is specifically to a family that would rent one of our UTH workforce housing units at a rate that basically has them afford it at 30% of their moderate income.
Okay, so it's based on a percentage of average household income.
Right.
And a percentage of that income for rent. That's
yeah.
And is that the broadest, is that the broad definition of workforce housing as well? Is that
it's
pretty standard?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And, many people have different versions of workforce housing, right? I mean, every person has their own interpretation of that. So our answer is ours is a rental model that happens to serve the families that I just described. But some people consider workforce housing to be for sale, right? But I think generally it's considered to be maybe attainable or more affordable than market rate, but not as deeply as affordable as your government subsidized housing. So I
Got it.
think on a generic fundamental basis, you would have that be the broader definition.
All right. And then are there any workforce housing programs or initiatives of any sort?
There are. It's a great question. I think it's really a how can I put this? It's an undersupplied market in the capital space, and because traditionally true affordable housing was, I think, the most well-known need in the marketplace and the most extreme need. All the government programs are oriented to that marketplace, meaning this true affordable, all the nonprofits that serve those communities, and that's in the more mainstream media. If you think of HUD, right, federal level housing urban development department, that's who that government entity serves, right? Luxury housing sort of takes care of itself if the market's sufficiently viable and we're in a uptick in the market cycle, on the economic cycle, then there's capital for that, and there has been traditionally. But this space in between is really new, and people argue, what do I mean by new? But if you think about it, and you hear stories, as I do, that people say, oh, in the old days, I could get I could have my first job and I could afford to rent a unit, on my own, or I could afford to buy a house. Now, what you hear today, particularly amongst the younger folks who are in the beginning of their careers, they cannot. And so I think that's one piece of evidence. I mean, there's others. One piece of evidence that says basically that housing prices and incomes have diverged. Remember, we talked about this gap in a minute or a minute ago. That is where that middle income space really is starting to expand, right? In fact, there was a stat I came across the other day. California Housing Partnership writes a market report on affordable housing and attainable housing. They happen to write about moderate income families. In LA County in 2019, the fastest growth in housing burdened households, meaning they're paying too much of their income towards rent, the fastest growth was in the moderate income category. It was 56% growth in that space. Now that's LA County, so it's a very specific set of people in that particular geographic region. But I think it really demonstrates that, that is the highest growth area of burden, right? That they're having to pay too much, and too much really is defined as more than 30% of their income, right? The gold standard in the industry is 30% of income is the correct amount of rent to pay as a function of your income so that you can afford the rest of the things that you need to do in your life.
Is there a banking definition of workforce housing?
I don't think so. I think what I spoke earlier, this 80 to 120 would be the closest to a bank definition.
Okay.
And let me be clear, moderate income housing, 80 to 120, and there's middle income, moderate income, workforce housing. Those are all used interchangeably in many places, including by myself. There are programs that serve that, and banks that will look for that particular space. But again, it's new, it's developing more sources of capital for that. But if you look at it in comparison to the other, true affordable and the market rate, the amount of capital in that space is much, much lower.
All right, so let's move on to the definition of, or the distinction, making a distinction between workforce housing versus affordable housing versus Section 8 housing. So explain to me the difference between these.
So let me define the first two first, and then I'll tag in Section 8 at the end of that, just because I think it's good to have the two reference points to be able to define Section 8. So affordable housing, in the way that I consider it, and I think in the industry standard, would be any housing that serves families that are at or below 60% of median income, right? So think 0 to 60% is what I call, and this is my own definition of true affordable housing, right? Where families, their incomes and the rents associated with those families that have those incomes are affordable at or below 60%, right? And almost every government program out there basically serves that space generally. And there's a little bit of, bleeding over 60% here and there, but just for this conversation, we'll say 60%, right? And then workforce housing, you could argue really is between then 61% and some upper figure. In some marketplaces like New York, they may use 120 or 150 or 180% of median income, right? In New York, they have moderate that fits in those, 150 and 180%. figures. But I think definitionally this 80 to 120 would be considered to be the moderate income space classically, right? Now, Section 8 fits into both those conversations, and that's why I answered the way I did. Section 8 provides a voucher to a family that, like most housing authorities issue vouchers. They have waiting lists of families that need help with housing through this government. It's really a HUD program that's allocated vouchers through the local housing authority in whatever market that the project is or where the tenant wants to live, right? So, on our Fullerton project, it would be Orange County Housing Authority would be the person who issues the voucher, right? They can go into any unit at all that accepts a voucher. That's really the key. In fact, California just passed a law that says that landlords can not now bar Section 8 tenants because of their Section 8 voucher alone. In other words, there's other criteria that landlords need to underwrite and can underwrite, credit history, rental history, that kind of thing. But that California state law as of January 1st, 2020 says no landlord can exclude a Section 8 tenant because of Section 8 voucher or the fact that they have that.
So how do they work actually, a Section 8 voucher?
So basically the way it works, just high level is, the voucher is issued by the housing authority to the family. And then the family will go find a housing unit that will accept the voucher and that the rent is generally coherent with the standards that the housing authority considers to be appropriate. And there's some published figures, something called the fair market rent, or FMR for short, which basically says this is what HUD and the local housing authority consider to be the fair market rent relative to what they would pay for a unit that has a voucher, right? That the tenant moves in and that's the rent that pays. So like as an example, I'm gonna probably not get the numbers exactly correct, but I think one of the markets that we're in the FMR for a 5-bedroom unit, and these rents, these FMRs are based on housing size. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bedrooms. Our units are 5-bedroom, 4-bath. And so that rent for that Section 8 FMR is $3,221. That's $3,221 a month, right? That when that voucher comes into that unit, that's in essence what the landlord can expect to receive as income from the voucher, right? Now there's some adjustments, and the housing authorities do need to look at market comparables, but it's based on, published FMRs, market comparables, and then most importantly, the tenant only pays 30% of their income, whatever that is. If their income is zero, then they pay 30% of zero, right? If they make, 10,000 a year, then it's 30%, right, of 10,000. And then the voucher makes up the difference, right? So say every year or every month, the tenant can pay $221 a month. That's 30% of their income. That's appropriate for what their income level is. Then the housing voucher will make up the difference, which is $3,000 a month. Now there's some other adjustments for utility allowances that are deducted from the rent, assuming that the tenant's paying, gas and electric and those kind of things. So the rent is lowered to allow them to have money to pay that. And then it lowers the voucher rent as well.
Is there any kind of workforce housing tax credits?
There is not. There was at one point one senator put forth the idea of a moderate income tax credit that never ended up going anywhere. And in fact, when that idea came out, we were exceptionally excited about it. So at this point, there is nothing active that could be in the future. I think if this divergence of housing prices and stagnant incomes continues to widen, then I think that you will have that. Now, there is a proxy or a related capital vehicle, which we can talk about as needed, but the opportunity zone capital space to me sort of allows capital to flow into marketplaces and serve moderate income projects, right? I mean, they can serve any kind of project that's in a qualified census tract for the opportunity zone, but it's not a tax credit, but it is a tax incentivized investment vehicle. And I think it pairs well with moderate income housing.
And what about grants for low income housing development? And
definitely grants for low income. To my knowledge, I don't see anything for moderate. Every city and marketplace is different. So I just speak to, my knowledge base in, the Western US and California specifically. but there's nothing generally out there in the marketplace at this
Okay.
point of any size. I mean, there
And
may be
no HUD grants or anything. And there's no similar programs for workforce housing development.
for pure workforce housing, there's not, right? And again, we need to be careful about workforce housing, because some people will say what I call true affordable tax credit finance. Some people will describe that as workforce housing, and there is a capability to do income averaging on a tax credit project where you could actually have 80% rents, but then the other end of the spectrum, you have to lower rents down to 30, 20, 10% of median income, very, very low.
I
Right?
see.
As long as you achieve a 60% or below average rent, then you qualify under the tax credit programs.
God, that's really technical stuff.
And so, but I will say this, I think that's generally not utilized as much. And I'm not we used to do tax credit housing. We don't do that actively. So some of my knowledge may be a little bit outdated, although the income averaging, that does exist. But I think if you look at a true affordable housing, almost all of the programs are set up, particularly in California, to give capital, to allocate capital to the lowest income families, right? Extremely low, deeply low income. Those are specific terms defined in the industry, because I think particularly in California, where we have a deep need for homeless housing and homeless housing with services or permanent supportive housing, those incomes need to be even more viewed. And so what you get is you'll have nonprofits and other people that are in that space that their goal is to give all the incomes across the entire project as low as possible. That requires government capital or subsidy, right? Which we've talked about as a finite source, never enough for that. But I think you see that the ethic of that space of true affordable housing really wants to drive rents as deeply down into low, very low, extremely low as possible.
I just typed out a question for you here. So affordable housing. So I worked on a project some years ago, actually in San Luis Obispo. I was trying to put together a deal, 100 and something units, and they were all small units. And the idea was that they were to be affordable. Now, you've used this term as well.
Yeah, right.
But affordable with the way I define the difference, affordable with lowercase a.
Yeah, right. I was
The uppercase A is as defined by the local municipality, right? So they
what
have
what I call true affordable housing.
Yes, what you've called true affordable housing. So in that lowercase a, the untrue affordable housing, would the so I've heard this concept as well, affordable by design, and these units actually were quite in contrast to the ones that you build. These were tiny little micro units, basically, but affordable by design. Does that also fall into the workforce housing category, do you think?
I think it would, yeah. And there's a term people use called attainable housing, which is the lowercase a affordable as you describe it, which means that it's not, government subsidized. It's just by some other mechanism made more affordable by design, right? We lower the cost of the unit, so we make it where we don't have to charge as much rent in the, pro forma. To make it viable, we can basically lower the rent by lowering costs. So that's what affordable by design basically is. Now, I will say this, that the UTH model, although it is bigger, 5-bedroom, 4-bath, 1,750 square feet, is a version of affordable by design. It just happens to be that it fits a larger family group with more wage earners. But because they can live in this unit and they can have more wage earners under one rooftop, the design has the house be attainable for them, or the rental unit be attainable, right? So this is a version of what I call economic sharing, right? So in other words, some sharing of some cost of the unit that allows that each individual has a more affordable payment to make. And you could say that your micro units that you described, that's a different form of economic sharing. It just happens to be that they are, they're maybe sharing the common area, sharing the project in a much smaller space, right? Their unit is much smaller. And so therefore they can get more units in the, one piece of ground, right? One piece of land. UTH 5-bedroom, 4-bath is just a different version of that. In fact, somebody, Richard Green, who's the director at the USC Lusk Center and a professor in the USC Price Real Estate Development School. When we talked about UTH, he goes, "Oh, what you're doing is you're providing density in bedrooms, not density in units." And I go, "That's exactly right." And so when you have a wage earner that has their own bedroom because they're living with their family, they may pay $500 or $600 or $700 a month for that bedroom, right? And the entire family spreads that cost around all the bedrooms in that particular unit. Micro units are just spreading the cost amongst other units that happen to be unrelated, neighbors in the next unit. Still economic sharing, though.
Fascinating. So now we've spoken about all the kind of laid the foundation for understanding what workforce housing is. Let's get on to the good stuff.
Okay.
How does an investor make money in workforce housing or in workforce housing development?
Great question. So our model UTH, so I'm going to speak about our model UTH, which stands for Urban Townhouse, and that's the 5-bedroom, 4-bath townhouse with a 2-car garage, just to give folks a sense of the format. We can generate really market superior yields on these UTH workforce housing projects for a number of reasons. And I'll sort of go through the list to describe that. So one of them, the first one we already talked about, is the format of the unit is a 5-bedroom, 4-bath unit. And that's really key because basically what it allows us to do is charge a rent. Right now we're averaging between $3,500 and $4,000 a month for a 1,750 square foot 5-bedroom, 4-bath unit. Right. So it's purpose built and designed to rent, but it lives like a house, right? It's got the garage, it's a townhouse. So it's a 3-story unit. You live above and below your own family, right? But that rent allows us to basically create high whole dollar rents in the pro forma, right? If you're charging $3,500 a month, that allows the pro forma to operate much more efficiently or effectively, maybe is a better way to say it. In other words, the gross rent provides more income for which to afford the cost of the project, right? Because in development, we always have to have the source of the income, and it has to be viably supporting the cost of the project to build it, right? Right. The dollar we spend has to produce sufficient income, right? And so that high whole dollar rent is really a unique characteristic of UTH, right? That allows us to create these high whole dollar rents. Now, remember, they're still affordable to the family because they have 2 to 4 wage earners, right? And so if they're producing 100 to 150,000 a year, which is our average bracket for 2 to 4 wage earners in California, Southern California, that they are paying 30% of their income, even though it is $3,500 a month. Right. So because of the format of the unit, we're able to provide these high whole dollar rents and then still have them be naturally affordable to tenants. Right. So that's number one. Okay. Is the high gross whole dollar rents that we produce. Okay. The second part is that we're able to buy land very efficiently. So one of the tenets of the UTH model is that we only want it to go, and it's perfectly coherent and appropriate for us to seek to buy sites in low and lower middle income neighborhoods. Okay. And what's unique about that is that we're able to buy land more efficiently because we have little or no competition from other builders because they're not seeking neighborhoods that don't have sufficient incomes to support their high-end luxury, product. Okay. But also it compacts the timelines, right? So we, in these neighborhoods, are generally finding, land that's affordable, and we don't really have much in the way of neighborhood resistance from a political standpoint, which I'll talk about in the next item I'm going to talk about. And so that just helps us basically acquire land more efficiently, right? Cost and time. Okay. So land price is the second one. Third one is that we're only buying sites that are already zoned, that are by right, to allow the development model UTH that we want to produce, which is about 22 to the acre, 3-story townhouse on grade, right? And so that also lends itself to compacting the timeline. So we're, again, time efficient because we're not going through a long drawn out political entitlement process, which California is, famous for, right? We actually are going the other direction from rezoning and entitlements. We're going just to seek and buy sites that are already, in essence, the zoning is ready to go. By right is the way we call it. The fourth one is that we're building very efficiently, right? So because we're building a 3-story on-grade townhouse product, We're able to simplify the designs. It's still a good product, right? If you walk the units, you would feel good about the finishes. We're doing modern colors. We're doing, a sort of engineered wood plank floor. We have a nice production cabinet. We're doing quartz countertops in a lot of our units these days. So the unit looks nice, but because of the configuration of the systems and structure of the building, we eliminate, underground or concrete parking structure, what we call a podium in the business. We just don't do any of that. This is on grade, okay? That we build the same unit over and over again. So we only do a 5-bedroom, 4-bath unit. And in fact, it's the exact same unit that we've refined over time. So we've been able to simplify across every choice of material, of structural systems, of how we design the buildings, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. And we pair that with subcontractors who we have a great sub base in Southern California. And we sort of use this design over and over again. We use the vendor team, think architects, engineers over and over. And then the subs are basically the same group that we execute over and over with. What that does is it really brings us directly into the production mentality or the production domain of residential housing, which you would classically see home builders in that space, right? They're building plan A, they're going to build that over and over and over again.
Right, production stuff, right?
Exactly. In fact, this, I say internally, this is the most production-oriented housing that we've ever done. Classically, in our business of urban housing and workforce housing, we might have built one-off projects, think a podium that just is designed for that specific site. That building only gets built once, and then the next one's different. Next one's different.
Right.
Here,
what kind of returns do you see?
So we have we have 2 models. The one we started with, which was our demonstration phase, we were generally in that phase, as we're now completing it now, generated 22.6% portfolio average sale IRRs. So we sold those projects to investors, and the price they paid, given the invested capital, we produced a 22.66 average IRR in the completion of that demonstration phase. Now we're moving to a long-term hold model. And that long-term hold model has a different orientation because, of course, when you invest $1 day one and you hold it for 10 years, naturally that IRR is going to lower over time. So we're shooting right now for about a 15% average internal rate of return on a 10-year hold. But as importantly, we're cash flowing that entire time, and we're producing a 3x equity multiple at the end of that 10-year hold. So invest $1, and at the end of 10 years, you get $3 back. So your original dollar back plus 2 in yield, right? To just give you a magnitude of the just whole dollar returns that you get. And then, of course, we're cash flowing in a stabilized, really safe, recession resistant investment model in this workforce housing over that 10-year period.
And what's the current yield during the hold period?
We're averaging probably about 4%, 4 to 5% cash on cash year one. And then generally, our models have, of course, we're early in the long-term hold phase, but we do underwrite conservatively. So we have, a 3% income boost each year. Although we are conservative and have 3.5 on operating expenses, so we're ramping up operating expense growth cost, right, at 3.5, but rents go up at 3. People will argue, is 3 the right number? What I do say is we don't trend our rents in the classic multifamily way where, hey, it took us, 16 months to build this, I'm going to bump my rents up by 10%. So in 18 months or 16 months, I've got 10% higher rents.
Right.
We're always underwriting.
And project an exit at 3 cap.
Right. Exactly. So, in fact, that's a great point.
In 3 years.
Yeah, right, exactly. They're going to keep going lower,
Yeah,
it's magic, right? It's magic.
And rents will keep going up.
Right. So, look, I think the story in California for rent growth, I think one of the reasons we love this workforce housing space is because it's generally undersupplied for the reasons that we talked about before, which is it's a new idea and it's a new marketplace to respond to. But right now it's deeply undersupplied. Those workforce housing families that are being dropped down the food chain of housing, right? Because they're, incomes are stagnant, housing prices are going up. People either do one of two things. Either they pay more in percentage rent, right? They become rent burdened, or the other choice is they just move down into inferior housing because it's cheaper, right? Or, we can provide units like our UTH models, and there's other versions of moderate. Don't get me wrong, ours is not the only, but ours is the only that I know at scale that's new construction moderate.
So actually, I was going to ask you that. Actually, I was going to ask it. So what other models are there of workforce housing?
Yeah. So we talked
kind
about
of broad, like a broad canvas.
Yeah. So really the two food groups that I see in the marketplace are what is mostly talked about in the media today for workforce housing would be people who acquire older apartment assets that are physically obsolete, or they're in bad shape, or they're in secondary, tertiary markets. And instead of buying those and value add them to the highest market rent, they'll value add just enough to make it a better project, but they either won't raise the rents at all, right? So say they have a moderate income average tenant base in a project in, what was I reading in, in like Dallas or Houston. And what people are doing is their capital is oriented around keeping the rents similar to what they were when they bought them, but increasing the how can I put this? Increasing the physical plant of the apartment building. They're rehabbing the interiors, paint, carpet, cabinets. So it's a better lifestyle for the tenant, but their ethic is around holding rents, basically where they're at already. Okay. So that's what I call the value add workforce housing model. And that's really it. And then our model of this new construction, naturally moderate income housing.
Right. So let's wrap up with a kind of a bigger picture.
Sure.
Discussion about kind of from a societal perspective. Why is workforce housing important?
Yeah. So I'll go back to that rent burden part of the conversation that I mentioned previously. So housing is such a fundamental need for human beings, right? Our biology requires that we have appropriate shelter. That's not to say that people, die because they move out of housing, but I think homeless populations are at the highest levels that we've seen, as best I can tell, in the history of the United States, at least as long as they've been being tracked the way we track them now. And California is the pinnacle of that, right? We have the highest percentage of population of any state in any state in the United States. And we have the most people in the United States who are homeless and who live in California. Some of those folks are on the street because they have mental health issues, maybe they have drug addiction issues, but there's a big component, and actually the highest percentage of growth in the homeless market is people are homeless by default. They're working families, they're working people, they're students, but they just don't make enough money to afford the housing the way it's priced in the marketplace in California and many urban areas now, right? So they just got dropped out. When I said it, they're dropped down the food chain, right? Eventually they drop off the food chain.
Yeah, it's funny that you should say that, actually, Scott, because my introduction to affordable with a lowercase a housing and what I try to replicate in San Luis Obispo, excuse me, was actually in the 1980s. I worked for a family office that was actually building SROs.
I see.
And they were these single room occupancy, these micro units. They had been done, but they were basically flea bag hotels.
Right.
But the city was very encouraging of these. And this is actually going to come back to your projects in a minute. Specifically about with this same punchline, if you like. The city liked them, but they wanted them in nice areas. So they rezoned certain areas. Of course, there was lots of uproar about it, but we built these really nice units. Actually, my first contact with Japan was going to Japan and looking at how the Japanese live, right, in these tiny units. And as a side note, when I lived in Japan, I lived in a room 100 square feet, almost 10 years. It's quite possible and in a way quite therapeutic for the mind to do that.
Get rid of your stuff, for sure.
That's a totally, you've kind of shed. You can't afford to have stuff.
Yeah, you have to.
But here's what was interesting. This is what I want to ask you about workforce housing. Was that, so we built these things and they leased up extremely quickly.
Hmm.
They were not like your property, like your the UTH model. They were not low cost construction, right? It wasn't low cost housing. It was
Hmm.
very expensive because we had to have a little kitchen and a bathroom
Hmm.
in every single one of these units. So you can imagine what that, what that cost.
That's right.
But
Yeah.
what was interesting was that I actually sold one of these right before the savings and loan crisis. So at the peak of the market,
Hmm.
Korean investor actually bought this, but one of these buildings that we developed. And he was the only person that I knew out of that wave of foreign investors of the 1980s that held on to his asset.
Right.
And that's because it was a cash cow. And
Right.
the reason that actually to connect the dots with what you were talking about was that you mentioned, and it's gone from my mind. You'd mentioned,
Like a defensive stance.
say again.
Oh, I'd use the term defensive, right? Like this is a defensive model.
Yeah, exactly. During a downturn, right?
That's your point about the micro unit project you describe, is that people basically defaulted to those micro units because they're probably on a whole dollar basis some of the lowest cost rental housing in San Luis Obispo, right?
Yes. Well,
And
and the point was that it was, yes, what reminded me of it was you said it brings, what is there if there isn't this kind of housing?
mhm. Yeah,
You know, you've either got flea pits or you have no housing,
right,
right? Basically.
right.
So
Well,
when
and
you
then the
bring
third
people,
option is new innovations like micro units or our UTH model,
exactly.
that provide a different way of the economic sharing model, right? I mean, that's what allows these units to be, how can we put it? Allows these units to be affordable to these families, or in a micro unit, it would be a single or a couple possibly, right?
Mm.
And it basically, it changes the way the economics work in the real estate project, right? And the pro forma of that project that allows the rents to be delivered that's attainable to these families or the people, the tenant, base that's appropriate for it, like the micro units, right? And I think that's, to me, the future of housing in this particular arena, because basically the way I see a government subsidized housing or true affordable housing that we've talked about, that's always a limited supply because government subsidy is only ever so much, right? It's a finite supply. It's never enough. And the demand is hugely outstripping the supply of those units. And those units are great. I mean, I'm hats off to the people who focus on that. I have friends and colleagues and people that I used to work for that do amazing work in that space. But I also say, if we're going to solve the housing problem, it can't be by that mechanism alone because it's finite, right?
Yeah, and I was going to actually get that. And the other thing that's nice about what you build is you actually want to build it. You're not being, it's not a mandated requirement, right? Inclusionary housing is not being forced upon you
That's right.
and
That's right. We're
squeezed into a spreadsheet or negotiated away to somebody
yeah,
else.
yeah.
You actually want to build this because you can make a lot of money doing it.
The old idea of doing well by doing good. We're very encouraged by the social mission of supplying, attainable housing to families or middle income housing to families. It also happens to be a great economic story, to your point, which is, you know, another old way of seeing it, find a need and fill it, right? The need is for middle income families to have good housing, right? If we want to keep our middle class, if we want to have those people be successful, right? I can't remember the statistic, but there's some huge amount of GDP that's suppressed in the state of California because our housing is so constrained that it'll either uses up people's money to spend if they're a family and use all your income to pay rent. You have no money left to, pay into the economy otherwise, or people just leave here or don't come here that might otherwise live here because they would like the weather or the lifestyle in California, but they look at the housing prices, they go, no, right? So I can't remember the statistic, but it was a vast reduction in overall GDP production, and it's like billions of dollars of suppressed economic activity. And that's not the only reason to do it, but if we say that we're going to be successful in our economic planning for the future, then this is an issue that needs to be resolved. Otherwise, we continue to be suppressed and we lose people, right, who drop off the housing food chain into homelessness, right? That's not a preferable thing. And in fact, if you look at the statistics, taking care of homeless from a government cost standpoint is a very, very high cost endeavor. And in fact, if you get a family that's homeless and get them into housing, right? Housing first is a model that people use. The reduction of load on the government for the cost reduction for that family is massive. And the family's so much better, right? Mental health, physical health, right? So I think the social impact story of this is very broad. And in fact, I say, Adam, that, our UTH model is one interpretation of how to innovate in the housing space using private capital, pairing it with workforce housing. But I'm like, we need, thousands and thousands of more of these innovations, right? If we're going to be successful, particularly in California, where we are so housing constrained, we need a lot more of this. So we're encouraging. In fact, this is one of the reasons that we get out in the marketplace. Now, we think the model is great, and we're going to continue to be fully focused. In fact, this is all we do now from a real estate development perspective. Is this moderate income UTH model is our entire business plan.
Let's wrap up with please. I'm going to include this on the podcast page for today's episode as well, which will be your website. But why don't you tell folk how they can find your amazing, really fabulous website that you've got, and how they can reach you if they want to find out more, because I know you've got some serious deal flow and some good pipeline stuff coming along.
Yeah.
Give me those details and then we'll sign off.
Yeah. So go to www.urbanpacific.com. If you want to get our contact information, there's a contact page. In fact, my email address and our direct lines are noted there. So reach out, email, text are the best methodologies. When you're there, visit the investor education page. We have numerous articles that we write about, how to assess projects as an investor, learning opportunities, videos, both, learning opportunities about, how projects are developed, right? Background there, but also, how to invest and how to assess projects. We have a, full podcast page that's on its way that should be up here soon. And then, we're just an available resource for people in the marketplace that have questions, and welcome to reach out directly.
And I took up my phone, not to be rude that I was looking for anything, but because you mentioned the best way to reach you is by text. And I want you to know that everybody on receiving ends of texts from me now have you to thank for the extreme length of the text that I sent, because you told me how to use the dictation tool.
Man, these texts are getting longer and longer. What the heck?
And instant. How does he do that so fast?
It's funny that you say that, because I've seen more and more of that. Now people are like, sort of keeping track of it. I have one group that I'm on a group text, which are obviously very powerful. But, they're like, okay, this is getting too long. I'm going to email now, right? Like
exactly.
Pages. But, I think in this day and age, Adam, it just cuts through all the background noise,
Yeah, and I really
doesn't get hung up in spam filters, which is always an ongoing.
Text doesn't, but the I don't know, the Siri dictation is almost perfect.
Right.
I've been trying all kinds of different ones on my PC.
Yeah.
And I can't find one that's anywhere near as good.
I agree. I've bought a couple software packages, and it was like, it took so much time to train it, and it still didn't do justice to it.
Yeah.
That I think, more and more. And of course, the software doesn't have the AI in the background, Google's, whatever teraflops of, AI data in the background to, ever improve, although Siri's not Google, but, think Alexa or Siri has these, learning capacities and AI behind it.
Hey, Scott, what a pleasure seeing you today. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. As always, it's good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate it.
That was the nation's foremost workforce housing expert, Scott Choppin, founder of Urban Pacific. Scott is developing one of the best marketing systems in the industry to raise capital for his deals, as I said earlier. And I'll show you exactly what he's doing in the free whiteboard workshop on the podcast page for today's episode, where I walk through the entire process in detail. You can access that on the podcast page for today's episode at gowercrowd.com. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening, and thank you, nation's foremost expert in workforce housing, Scott Choppin, founder of Urban Pacific, for your time with me today. It was a pleasure as always. That's all for this episode. I'll see you next time. And for now, this is Dr. Adam Gower signing off.